Okay, this is a summary to a lesson I gave on how United States neoconservatives are manufacturing a new Cold War. All right, we already fought one Cold War. Now we're manufacturing a new Cold War, and it is U.S. that's manufacturing that war. I gave you the first two initial lessons, which are really the bulk of the lesson. Now, what I want to do is give you a summary or conclusion, right, which reviews some of the items, reinforces them, and I know I have to reinforce them because it's been almost 2 weeks since I started this, and by now I'm sure nothing's remembered. So what I want to do today is I want to dispel the false notion that America is a peace-loving nation, and I want to do this with fact. All right, and so that's what I'll do first. And the second thing I'll do is get to a abbreviated summary of the many tricky ways the United States has started wars. Right? Not only do we fight a lot of wars, but we start these wars in clever, tricky ways to manipulate the population into the war. Right? So it should be no surprise. People will think, oh, the U.S. Doesn't start wars. It should be no surprise that we start wars in clever, tricky ways because we do it over and over and over. Oftentimes in the same way, so that history repeats itself. And history repeats itself because no one learns from history. Americans, just fall for the same thing over and over. So that's the second part of this. And here's some examples that I'm going to go through. And then what I want to do is I want to put American warfare within the context of the larger industrial revolution, all right, and then show fundamental transformations that occurred over time in due to the industrial revolution and changes in warfare, to give you insight into to how things are changing even up to today, right, and the impact upon geopolitics and warfare. All right, so today I want to focus on, dispelling the false myth that America is a peace-loving nation. All right, so I think the only way people can believe that America is a peace-loving nation is if they know absolutely nothing about U.S. wars, which unfortunately is probably 99.99% of Americans, even though they think they know about U.S. wars. When you ask them to state something, they can't state anything. All right. So I believe it is utterly safe to say to the contrary, that instead of being a peace-loving nation, the United States has been the most militaristic and warmongering nation in recent history. Who has fought more wars than the United States? Who has started more wars than the United States, other than maybe Great Britain? Great Britain, who was the most imperialistic, dominating nation, maybe in the past 300 years. All right, so again, I believe people will think this is crazy, but let's look at the facts. All right, here is a list of all these wars that we fought. You can see that it goes on and on and on. A huge list of wars. We're constantly fighting. All right, and of all these wars, only a handful, can you say, are justified. All right, for example, the Revolutionary War. I believe that's justified because why should we be slaves to Great Britain? Why should they be exploiting us? Any anti-piracy wars and freedom of navigation because they cannot attack our commerce. World War II, simply due to the fact that Nazi Germany was literally evil. All right, even besides the fact that the power elite helped finance the rise of Hitler in the Nazi Party and helped rebuild the Nazi war machine, the U.S. Power elite. Probably the Korean War, you could say, is justified, but I'm honestly not an expert in the Korean War, so I don't know enough to say for sure. Any of the wars to suppress rebellion, including the Civil War or Shays Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, you could say are justified. Other than that, these wars were expansionist, either trying to gain territory or economic expansion in some way or another. And thus, each of these wars were wanting and aggressive and grasping, right, and greedy. They weren't noble defensive wars, or patriotic wars. They were just greedy wars. All right, so I want to focus on the wars after 1775 and the start of the Revolutionary War. However, we'll start with 1607 and the establishment of the Jamestown colony, right? First English settlers here in America, right? As soon as they came, they were facing starvation, and they were saved by the Indians, giving them food, which is the mythological basis for Thanksgiving. But within 3 years, they were waging war with them, expanding into Indian territory, taking their land. And all these wars were expansionist wars, expanding into Indian territory until we established the 13 colonies. All right, on and on and on. Constant warfare. There's coming up a big section where there's peace. All right. And these are British-Spanish wars. There's some British-French wars. British-French-Indian wars. So when in each of these British, French, Indian wars, basically the French were aligned with the Indians. The British were enemies of the French. They were competing colonial powers, imperial powers, and as it turns out, the Indians aligned with the French because the French were not a land. They were not in a land expansionist. Colonists so much as Britain. They were more establishing trading posts and utilizing the territory for hunting and fur gathering. All right, so 1875 American Revolutionary War. You could say that this is our real Declaration of Independence, even though the Declaration of Independence was in 1776, right? Our real declaration was when we started fighting the war, right? And you see that it's multiple wars going on here, not just the American Revolutionary War, but the Cherokee War. And from then on, there's wars every damn year, except for a very few. These highlighted in this greenish gray are years where there wasn't war. All right, so there's a slug here. Here's most of the wars years where we didn't fight wars. After this, there's very few. And as we go along, the number of wars that we fought at the same time increased from like 1, 2, or 3. Now we're fighting 7, 6, 7 constantly. Now up to 8. There were 4 years in which we fought 8 wars at the same time. Most of these wars are against the Indians, taking their land. And now we're in the 19th century. Sluggy years in the 1930s where we didn't have war. Right? Then 1 year after World War II, and then the Cold War started. And it's been war after war after war. Okay, so this is 2019. Now, if you add up the years between 1775 to 2019, that's 244 years of U.S. existence. And during this time, we fought 675 war years. Right? Now, that's 2.77 wars every single year on average. So we fight almost 3 wars every year of our existence. Right? Now, so that's a very militaristic nation. Now, for only 16 of those years, the U.S. has not been at war. Right? Only 16 out of 244 years. The vast majority of our wars are aggressive, expansionist wars. All right. So that dispels this myth that America is a peace-loving nation and that we don't fight wars. We're constantly fighting wars. Right? And the vast majority of wars have been for expansion, for aggression. So I want to give you a small sample of expansionist, aggressive wars, and I'll try to keep it simple. And then I'll give you a brief introduction into clever, tricky ways which we manipulate. The U.S. manipulated the population into these wars. All right. In green are ones that I've taught you already. I want to teach these again, at least in a brief, abbreviated form, because I know that people probably remember nothing from these wars. I hate to say it, but nothing's probably retained. So I've taught these multiple times, many times. I made multiple videos of these, right? But I feel I have to teach this again because it just fades from people's minds, and they think, if I say, "Oh, the U.S. starts clever, tricky wars, you can't trust the U.S." They're like, "You're crazy. You're insane. You're a joke." I mean, come on. Put this together in your head. Try to retain something. We have started so many tricky wars. All right, so here's a quick summary of expansionist wars. Now, from the get-go, from 1607, first white settlers coming to America, right? First English settlers, starving, fed by Indians. Within 3 years, they're whacking the Indians, taking their land, right? Including the French Indian Wars, right? Which was aggressive, driven by American colonists who were greedy for land, who were what I want to say, thirsty for land, or desperate for land. Well, how do you get land? You got to kill the Indians. You got to take their land. And by the eve of the Revolutionary War, we had the 13 colonies pretty much established here. So we went from, in 1607, one little point in Virginia, tiny. If you look at the Jamestown settlement, it's tiny, to acquiring the 13 colonies. All right. Then the next big aggressive war was 1812. Now, a lot of people are going to say that wasn't an aggressive war. That was a war that was pushed upon us by the British impressment of our sailors. All right. So there's really two ostensible reasons for this war, all right, that are stated by historians. Okay, well, one is impressment of American sailors, but that was going on since 1793. That's 19 years that's been going on. Why all of a sudden are we going to make a war for that, right? Impressing some sailors, most of which were British deserters, right? Although it is uncertain. I haven't seen the numbers, but from what I understand, there was a high rate of British desertion because they're being forced into the Navy against their will, right? Under harsh conditions, and they said, "Screw this! We might as well get paid better." So they joined the American Merchant Marine, right? British was desperate for sailors, so because they're trying to maintain a blockade around all of Europe, stretching from Russia, right, through the Baltic, through the North Sea, and then around Spain, Atlantic, right, into the Mediterranean. They had a high need for sailors, right? So they're impressing our sailors, right? But a lot of these were British deserters, right? And another key point is it was a wartime exigency, which is going to end with the end of the war, right? Is it worth it invading Canada with all the loss of life and all the devastation to both the Canadian population and the American population for something that was not that great in significance, and was going on for 19 years already without us doing anything, and would only last 3 more years. Now, the second reason was the British 1807 Order of Council, in which they tried to block U.S. commerce and trade with Europe. Well, that's not good for our economy. That's not good for our trade, even though our economy was, the vast bulk of it was domestic, internal, commerce, right? A good 5% or so was still, overseas commerce. All right. However, we declared war on June 18th of 1812. On June 23, only 5 days later, Britain rescinded this order, right? No doubt to undercut and take away any excuse for the United States going to war. Britain didn't want to go to war with us. Britain was locked in a life or death struggle against Napoleon. That was their main focus. They didn't want to have to be, to divide their forces, to have a two-front thing, right? It was a nuisance for them in the United States. But for the Americans, it was an opportunity with Britain, locked up in a life or death struggle of Napoleon. This was our chance. Anyway, so they rescinded it. So the only real excuse here was, impressment. Now, another excuse, which I'll try to get into and explain, was the British were supplying weapons to the Indians in the Northwest Territory. All right, so I'll try to explain this in an organized way. Hope I don't screw it up. The Northwest Territory today is the Midwest. It's Michigan here, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. All right. Now, this territory was ceded from Britain to the United States after the Revolutionary War with the Treaty of Paris. They gave this to us. They said, okay, you can have this, right? However, they weren't allowing us to populate it. Right? They're supporting the Indians, and the Indians didn't want to get kicked off their land because that's their lives, right? So they're fighting, and they're fighting with the support of British weapons, right? Now, this is at a time when the U.S. population in the colonies was growing and having a greater and greater demand for food, and with the New England climate and soil being not optimal for food production, agriculture. We needed the Northwest Territory and the fertile plains here, right? And the only way you could develop that land and produce on that land was if you can get your products, your commodities, whatever it is, grains, cattle, whatever, timber, to market. And the only way back then to get it to market was through the main waterways, through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Waterway, which actually runs up here. Right? And that became a great site of battles, a main focus of battles of the War of 1812. Although I'm not an expert in the war, I know that there was a lot of battles centered upon that, right? Which is critical because that's a key waterway. This is at a time before we had canals. This is at a time before there were railroads, right? So the only means of mass commodity transport was through the lakes and the rivers, right? The St. Lawrence Waterway here. All right, so now, if you block that waterway, if you block this, you cannot develop this land, right? And then you cannot feed the growing population here. So that was a problem. Another problem was, a key thing was it was still uncertain who was going to settle the North American continent, right? Now, at the time, there were four contenders. Well, five contenders with the Indians. There were the Indians, there were the Americans, there were the British, French, and the Spanish. The Spanish were in the south, right? All this was Spanish territory. But, however, in 1803, Napoleon sold out and sold us the Louisiana territories, which runs roughly up the Mississippi, up here, and kind of in a funnel shape over here, right? So he sold out. He gave up his attempt to have a colonial empire over here, and just got some quick cash to fight his wars. I think it was $25 million. All right, and so France is out. That leaves U.S., Americans, British, and Spanish. Now, the situation with Spain is Spain was weak. In 1812, they're super weak, all right? Because what happened was in 1807, France invaded Spain, and for 7 years until I believe it went from 1807 to 1814. They fought the Peninsular War, where Spain invaded them, or France invaded Spain, right? And France was occupying big chunks of the territory. So Spain was on its back, fighting desperately for its life, right? Now, what happened in 1810 in the Americas, in the Southwest here, in Mexico, and Central and South America, all the way down here, the Spanish colonies revolted, right? 1810, you had Mexico rebel, fight a war. You had Colombia rebel, Venezuela, and Peru, all the way down to the tip of South America. Right, they're all rebelling, and so Spain is fighting for its life in Spain itself, and they're losing everything, and they would lose all their territories by around 1821 or 1823 or so. I think Mexico was 1821, but I think the Revolutionary Wars led into about 1823. All right, so they're on their back, right? They can't even hang on to their own territory, so they're no threat to the United States. There was disputes between the western boundary of the Louisiana Territory between the United States and Spain. However, they couldn't do anything about that. They're fighting their own wars, and they're losing them. All right, they can't even hang on to Mexico. How are they going to attack us? So they're not a threat. Now that left just Great Britain, right? So we could focus on Great Britain. We could focus on attack into Canada, right? Especially given the fact that Great Britain was at war, and their main war effort was not against the United States, it was against Napoleon, right? They're fighting for their life there. All right, now, so that's another factor to develop the Northwest Territory, which, according to treaty, was rightfully ours, although, of course, the Indians lived there, right? And another factor was determination of the border between British colonial Canada and the remaining Western Territory, not just the Northwest Territory, but this territory was disputed and fought over here. And the 49th parallel here, this boundary was not determined until 1846 with the Oregon treaties. So all this is up in the air, right? Where is this going to go? Now the other motive would be to take Canada. Not only do you settle once and for all where the boundary is, if you get Britain out of North America altogether at this point, and at this point they're most vulnerable, right? They're at war with Napoleon. Then we don't have the border disputes. Then we also have all the Canadian resources, right? So that's this was clearly an expansionist war. We were trying to take Canada. Don't tell me it was about this minuscule thing about impressing sailors, right? A few the impressing sailors, most of which were British deserters. Okay, so British obstructing expansion to the Northwest Territory, Louisiana Purchase, and Oregon, right? And we want to take Canada. And one interesting fact is, like I said, big battles are fought over the waterways, right, to control the waterways. Well, we were able to establish control of water access all the way up through Lake Ontario. They're right about there. The St. Lawrence waterway is out of bounds for the United States. It kind of goes up here, right? So we did not succeed in getting water access all the way to open ocean, and I think that was probably a big reason why the Erie Canal was built. The construction of the Erie Canal was huge. It had huge impact economically. That made possible the development of all this territory. Remember I said that in order to develop this territory, you have to have a means of transporting goods en masse, right? That didn't exist until the Erie Canal was built, because all the St. Lawrence waterway from about here on up was in Canada, right? And this Erie Canal cuts from the eastern portion of Lake Erie, which is right about there, to the Hudson River. And that was huge in developing the agriculture in the Northwest Territory here, right? So that was started in 1817 and 25, and that was able to. So that was important in allowing for the development of the East Coast population, feeding the East Coast population, right? So I'm thinking the war is more about that, right? Issues like that. That's establishing this boundary or taking Canada is forever. This is 3 more years, right, of a minuscule thing, of little significance compared to what, all the resources here, That's huge. That was the real deal. Although you don't want to say that, because that looks like you're greedy. You want to put it upon the other people. Oh, those are impressing and receiving. This was an excuse. All right, so let's see. Yeah, right. Fifth thing I want to look at, Florida. So here's Florida. All right, these are a bunch of wars we fought to take Florida between 1810 and 1819. Eventually, when Spain sold it to us, but they sold it to us after we essentially took it. All right, so the first war is in 1810 versus Spain, And like I said, we purchased up to, like New Orleans, coming up the Mississippi, then this way from the French. That's the Louisiana Territory. But Spain held the territory east of there along the coast here, through the Florida Panhandle down into Florida. So this was Spanish territory. Well, in 1810, we took this from Spain, just east of New Orleans. We took this area. Then that was the 1810 war against Spain. Then that's West Florida. That's considered West Florida here. Then in 1813, we fought another war against Spain. We took essentially the Mobile, Alabama territory. So here's Florida. Here's the Panhandle. Mobile has only one small access to the Gulf of Mexico, and that's right about here, right? Yeah, Mobile, Alabama. Alabama has only that access, right? We took that territory in 1813. Then 1814, we fought against Britain in Pensacola. I guess British had some settlers there, and we took that territory roughly around there. Then in 1816, we invaded into the main portion of Florida and fought a war, ostensibly against part of the reason was for escaped black slaves would escape down into the Spanish territory, and they established a fort called I think it was called Fort Negro. And so we fought a war against that to reduce the problem of slave runaways. And then in 1816, we fought a war against Spain and the UK. It was the first Seminole War, right? And we pretty much occupied the bulk of the Florida peninsula, right? And then there was one more war, 1817, for Amelia Island, a little island right about there, right? So you can see that we're progressively fighting wars to take territory coming in here, and essentially we took Florida, right? And then in 1819, Spain sold it to this, but by then it was pretty much a lost cause for them. They'll lose everything here. Mexico would go independent. Mexico was about like this, right? And down here, coming towards the Yucatan Peninsula, right? They would go independent, fighting the war in 1821, I believe, right? So Spain's like, man, we're losing everything. We might as well get something for this. We'll salvage something and get some money for this. They took it already, so they sold it to us. But we essentially took it already. Another thing I want to talk about is gold. We'll talk about several cases where we fought wars for gold. Most of the wars fought against the Indians were for land and resources. One of the resources was gold, right? It was all for land and resources, but one of the resources was gold. And in 1829, gold was discovered in Georgia. I forget the name of the place. I think it was called like Dalhaga or something like that. Way up there in northern Georgia, kind of close to South Carolina, right? So gold is discovered there. That was the first gold rush in the United States. All right, now, got to get that gold. That's Indian territory. So in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, and that was passed as a cheaper legal means of removing the Indians, using our laws to remove the Indians as opposed to fighting wars, all right? And the idea was, okay, Indians are going to be removed from everywhere east of the Mississippi. So the Indians were given promised lands. The Mississippi runs down here, all lands west of the Mississippi, all right? Now, of course, the Indians didn't want to move, so they appealed to the U.S. courts. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Indians. But Jackson was having none of that, President Jackson, and he forced them out under gunpoint. And that resulted in the Trail of Tears, in which 1 out of 4 Indians died being pushed to Oklahoma. Oklahoma is roughly around here, right? It was pretty horrendous, people starving along the way. All right, so that's an example. Gold, discovered gold, the first gold rush. You got to get the Indians out. You have the Indian Removal Act, right? Forcibly removed, Trail of Tears, 1 out of 4 died. Then in 1873, the Coinage Act was passed, and that put the United States onto a de facto gold standard. It wasn't officially stated, but it, in effect, made it a gold standard because it demonetized silver. Silver was demonetized. That was just a small clause that was snuck into the 73 Coinage Act that effectively put us on the gold standard at a time when other nations were rushing onto the gold standard. All right. And then in 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Now, by 1874, the boundary promised to the Indians had been pushed back from the Mississippi to the Missouri River, which roughly ran from St. Louis around here up this way. All right, so they had everything over here. Black Hills are way deep into that, right? So you got to take that gold, all right? And so they sent U.S. forces deep into the interior, into Indian territory to kick the Indians out and to start a war. And a key factor was the General Custer or Colonel Custer's attack upon the Sioux Nation. I think there were Cheyenne also were plentiful within that group. It was a mixed Sioux Cheyenne at Little Bighorn, and that kicked off a war. And we hunted down the Indians over a brutal winter, and then took all that territory. All right, so took the gold, took the territory. We took the Black Hills gold. All right, that resulted in the Sioux War. All right, then in 1877, gold was discovered in the Palos area, which is up here near kind of like the corners of Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho, right around there. That was the territory where the Nez Perce Indians lived, so we had to wage a war upon them to get that gold, right? And the Nez Perce Indians were hunted down and chased this way, all up here. I think it was in North Dakota or somewhere in North Dakota. They tried to cross into Canada. They got 30 miles short of the border there, right, on their way up to Canada to escape into safe territory, but they didn't quite make it, and they were caught up with and then massacred 30 miles away. So they had wage war to take their gold, and then but I believe the key reason for this was the U.S. economy was heavily dependent upon Western expansion. And with Indians occupying that land, you cannot conduct Western expansion economics. You cannot develop that land, right? So land development and railroad expansion went hand in hand. You cannot develop that land without transportation. You have to get whatever you produce to market en masse, right? You can't grow tons and tons of wheat and just let it rot there. You have to have a way to get it to market. So land development was impossible unless you developed trains. And at the same time, train development was impossible unless you developed the land, because without production on the land, you have no freight to carry, and you can't make a profit. So the railroads would go bankrupt. Right? So both railroad expansion and Western expansion went hand in hand, and both of those grew our economy. So the underlying big factor, I believe, is not the gold, but the Northern Pacific Railroad and how important that was to the economy back then. I'm not going to go into the details of that. But that did kick off the Panic of '73, right? The failure of the Northern Pacific Railroad that took down our economy. All right, let's see. So underlying reason was expansion of the Northern Pacific Railroad, and the underlying reason behind that was the U.S. economy. All right, now another example of U.S. expansion wars was 1835, the Texas Rebellion. Essentially, Americans were pouring into Mexican land. Right? Today we have, of course, Trump and all his supporters, right? All crazy about Mexicans coming in. All right. I kind of agree with some of Trump's stuff. I agree that we have to let immigrants in, but we want to let the skilled workers in. You want to focus on them, right? But anyways, back then the situation was reversed. It was Americans pouring into Mexico, right? Out of control, ignoring immigration restrictions, not following Mexican law, including paying taxes. Right? There were import taxes that they weren't paying. And then a key tipping point was when what was happening is Americans were pouring into the Mexican territory over here, which is now Texas. They're pouring in more and more, and Mexico was threatened with loss of this territory as it was being dominated by now Americans. So they tried to tighten up their constitution. When they originally wrote their constitution, I believe it was ratified in some like 1823, I believe. Their constitution was first written. It was written as more of a loose federation, and then they voted within their Congress to amend their constitution, which they have every right to do, right? To make it more of a centrist government, right? To try to like tighten the belt a little bit and try to keep from the parts from breaking away. So they try to clamp down, on better controlling their territory. And all the Americans who poured in there rebelled, and they said, "Screw this, right? We're not following your laws. We're not paying your taxes. We're not obeying your immigration restrictions, right? Right? We see this as unconstitutional." Well, come on. They have a right to amend their constitution like we have a right to amend our constitution. But based on this, we said, that justifies a war, so we, the Texas Americans rebelled, and they fought the first rebellion, which involved the Alamo, and then in 1845, President Polk annexed all of Texas, right? And Mexico didn't agree with that because that was based upon a forced treaty signed when General Santa Anna was imprisoned and under threat for his life, right? As soon as he was released, he said, I reject this treaty because it was signed under duress with the threat of his life. And there is good witness testimony that he was, in fact, threatened with his life with knives to his throat, and by Americans who were hot because of why? Because of the massacres at the Alamo and Goliad. Two massacres where hundreds of Americans were summarily, executed, which actually Mexico had every right to do, because if you threaten sedition, overthrow the American government, you can be executed. So, he did that. These guys are trying to overthrow the Mexican government or overthrow territories in the Mexican state. So he executed all those people who he captured. And they were hot. So they forced him to sign this. Well, he didn't recognize it. And then what happened in the Mexican-American War, President Polk, who annexed Texas and who was elected upon an expansionist platform, and who took all the rest of the continental U.S. territory. In 1846, he settled the Oregon Treaty, this territory here, and this boundary. And with the Mexican-American War, he took all the territory in the southwest U.S., roughly around here. Coming up here, California, Nevada, part of Wyoming, Utah, part of Colorado, right, coming out of Texas, right, including all Arizona and New Mexico, and that's part of Texas here, right. Big chunk of our land was taken with that war. Okay, that's the Mexican-American War, 1846-48. So what happened was he marched troops way down to the Mexican border here. Although Mexico claimed this was their territory, we said it's ours. Then we set up fortifications there, artillery batteries, aimed into the town of Matamoros, across the Rio Grande here in Mexico, right? And for about a month, we tried to provoke conflict. When that didn't occur, General Zachary Taylor ordered his naval auxiliary forces in the Gulf of Mexico to blockade the mouth of the Rio Grande, right, which is an act of war, right? So this is all aggressive act of war. We're provoking a war, and then we conduct an act of war. This is the route of resupply to the Mexican 10,000-man garrison at Matamoros, right? And this initiated a conflict. Mexicans crossed over the Rio Grande, I believe. How many Americans died? Something like 11 Americans were killed in this skirmish, right? Like 6 to 11. I can't remember exactly what it was. Basically, a small handful were killed in the skirmish. And based upon that, President Polk said American blood has been spilt on American soil, and we went to war. There's a great big patriotic outcry, and all these Americans joined up to go fight the dirty, evil Mexicans who attacked us, right? Well, this was a totally provoked war. 1861 to 1865, we had the Civil War, and the Civil War, the key outcome of the Civil War was not just slavery, but it opened the way for unbridled Western expansion. And between 1865 and 1890, 5 continental railroads were built, and we settled over half the American continent. More land was settled in the 25 years after the Civil War than all the previous years before that, right? So, roughly you had Minnesota, I think, was in right. Yeah, I think Kansas was in. I don't think Nebraska was part of a state that got statehood yet, right? But after the Civil War, all the rest of the territory was settled. Now, what this required was massive, large-scale war against Indians. Right? Again, to expand into the territory, you have to develop the land. To develop the land, you have to build railroads. To make railroads financially feasible, you have to develop land. To develop the land, you have to kick the Indians off. You can't be growing, wheat and cattle when the Indians are there. You had to kick them off. And so wars were continuously fought. It was a constant battle for 25 years. Now, the reason why those wars were so intense, one of the reasons why, this is the Indians' last stand. Well, one reason was there was rapid expansion into their territory. 2, when all the wars were fought early on, at least the Indians could be pushed back, further and further. Back across the Mississippi, back across the Missouri River, right? But now, Indians have nowhere to go. They're just being pushed all the way to the end of the edge of the continent, or they got to be forced onto reservations, which were pretty miserable. A lot of starvation going on those reservations, a lot of mistreatment, a lot of corruption in government contracts to support the Indians, where people were lining their pockets instead of actually feeding the Indians. All right, so yeah, the Civil War cleared the way for Western expansion, and we rapidly expanded. That became the driving force behind our economy during those 25 years, maybe 28 years, all right? Required clearing the Indians, and so you had near continuous Indian wars, right? Finally, ending at a key ending point was the massacre in Wounded Knee in 1890. And then from there on, we started expanding commercially overseas. Well, we were expanding commercially overseas before that, but there was a big shift with the Spanish-American War, expanding into Asia, right? Commerce into Asia, and then in 1899, we had to take the Philippine Islands. I'll explain this when we get to the Spanish-American War. The key islands in all the Pacific are the Philippines. Those are the most strategic islands in the Pacific because around a 600 arc around the Philippine Islands, all of Asia lies among them. So they're the key islands controlling commercial access to all of Asia. And so we fought a war 1899 to 1913, 14-year war against the Filipinos, right? The first attack of the Spanish-American War was not in Cuba. It was in the Philippines, at Manila Bay. And when we first landed troops in the Philippines, they were welcomed as liberators from the Spanish. But then they soon realized that Americans weren't there to liberate them, but to take over. So they fought a 14-year war against us, and we had to suppress them. And a lot of brutal torture was used in this war. So 14-year war to suppress the Philippine Rebellion. And then, so this is overseas. So we fought expansionist wars. This is our start of expansionist wars overseas. These are wars, the Banana Wars are wars in expanding economically into Latin America. All right, a whole bunch of wars there. 36 years of wars there. All right, so these wars, America fights a lot of expansionist wars, economic wars. All right, and I've taught you a lot of tricky ways in which we started these wars. Iraq invasion war, Vietnam War, U.S. conflict creation in the Middle East, all sorts of conflict creation in the Middle East. Pearl Harbor, World War I, Spanish-American War, Mexican-American War, Texas Takeaway, the Sioux War, War of 1812. Many Indian wars. I didn't teach all these Indian wars, and I didn't teach the Revolutionary War. But these are the wars I've taught. I've taught you these, highlighted in green. And I remember making plus signs, bold in italics, highlighted in green, as a reminder that once I taught you and once you believed, even though you may remember nothing now. But I know it's not good enough, because if I say, well, America starts wars in very tricky ways, people just laugh. That's crazy. And you know why they can laugh? Because they have nothing in their heads. They remember nothing. They retain nothing, right? All they have is what social reality is telling them. If social reality says it's crazy, that's the reality, based on nothing. All right. So, quick summary of this: the U.S. has been almost constantly at war. 228 out of 244 years. Only 16 years not at war between this period, right? And usually we fight multiple wars at the same time, for a total of 675 war years, right? So if you take 675 divided by 244 years, that gives you 2.77 wars every year we fight on average, right? We fought as many as 8 wars at the same time. For 4 of those years, 4 of the 244 years, we fought 8 years at the same time. Mostly wars against the Indians at the same time. And one example is 1864. You had the Texas Indian Wars, you had the Apache Wars, Navajo Wars, so these are Indians. You had the American Civil War, Yavapai War, Colorado, Shimonoseki. That was Shimonoseki. That's Japanese, I guess. I believe that's in Japan. Yeah, that's Japanese. Snake War, that's Indian War. All right. The U.S. has been almost constant war since 1941, from World War II into the first Cold War, 40 years, then the War on Terror, and now a new Cold War is being artificially manufactured. By who? By the U.S. neocons. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all manufactured perception. And again, it's another king with no clothes, just like the first Cold War. I'll explain to you why the first Cold War was a king with no clothes. And so also is this. Now, I'm going to have to review the things that were done to start this Cold War. I taught it all already, and I know very, very little, if anything, is remembered. Perhaps nothing is remembered. So that's why I have to do this review. Now, what I want to do is I want to give you more detail about this. I know you don't remember this either, right? So I'm going to give you just a brief summary of all these wars. Try to keep it short and simple. Now, the risk you take when you want to make it short and simple is you're going to water it down and minimize it, right? You're going to leave out all the detail, the facts that were done. I run that risk doing this, but I can't teach it all again. I just have to give you a quick, brief summary of how the tricky things that were done for this war. And I'll just give you a little feeler for what I'm going to do. We're first going to talk about the Iraq invasion war, how the Bush administration manipulated the vast majority of Americans. Vast majority of Americans were manipulated into wanting this war. Vietnam War, vast majority of Americans were manipulated into this war. Vast majority of congressmen, 100% of congressmen voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. All but 2 senators voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Right, that's like unheard of. That's how effective this manipulation was. I'm going to put that in there. Okay, all right. Then I'm going to just touch upon all the conflict in the Middle East that we manufactured wars, manufactured conflict. I'm want to just scroll through my lesson 4 on exchange theory, but I'll focus on one incident. There's many instances where we created conflict. One was the overthrow of the Iranian democracy and the installation of the dictator, the Shah, with Operation Ajax. All right. I'll just run through how that was done, the key points here. All right, and you'll see how tricky this is. And it's all about manipulating public perception, and both Iranian and U.S. public perception. All right, Pearl Harbor. Now, I think I've taught Pearl Harbor well enough, but again, I question what people remember, so I'll teach it again. And I can't get into all the details, so I'll just give the summary chart. All right, hopefully that'll be enough. I'll go into World War I again. So you see I'm going backwards in time. Then I'm going to go to the Spanish-American War. And I'm going to skip much of this, I'm thinking, because it's too much information, too much detail. I'll get too lost in this, too caught up in this, and no one's going to follow. All right, I'll try to keep it simple then. And then get into the Sioux War, and Mexican-American War, and Texas Takeaway. And then I think I'll get into War of 1812. That's probably it. They'll probably do it. Okay, that's probably it for today. Hopefully I made my point that U.S. just fights war after war after war. We're not the peace-loving nation that people think we are. This is the absolute facts, right? This is the wars we fight constantly. All right, and these are not like defensive wars. These are expansionist wars, aggressive wars, expanding both territorially, expanding economically. All right, that's it for today.